The Oppo Find X6 Pro versus the iPhone 14 Pro. Right now you're looking at the front-facing camera, which is maxed out at 1080p on Oppo versus 4K 60 on iPhone. I'm not sure why a lot of the Asian phones are capped out at 1080p, but hopefully they're gonna bring it to 4K one day. And thank you for the 100K subs. I wanna go out and eat lunch, and then we're gonna do a Lenovo event tonight. Alright, let's start off with the obvious on the ultrawide is the iPhone is a lot wider in both pictures and video. In the shadows, I do notice that you can see more detail in the Oppo than the iPhone most of the time, which is pretty helpful when you're shooting a person who's in the shadows but the background is super bright. I do want to point out that the Find X6 is one of the best camera experience all around in terms of ultrawide, wide, and telephoto lens, but it's only available in China. One thing I'll say about the iPhone is that it does a great job exposing for the highlights, so notice that you can see more detail in terms of color, whereas on Oppo it can be too bright. For the low light experience, it is very snappy on an iPhone versus the Oppo, where it's a bit more slower, and especially when you're in darker spots, it'll tell you to keep on holding it still or steady, and even though it is slower, I would say the results are better on the Oppo. It is a day and night difference, you can see a lot brighter images, and even though it's not in night mode, it does a lot better job than an iPhone. Now the ultrawide video on the Oppo is pretty close to the wide if you go back and forth, and if you're in tight spaces it may not be enough, and even so it doesn't give you that super ultrawide look that some might want. And looking at it, the colors do pop, whereas on the iPhone it is really washed out. For low light, I would always recommend sticking with the wide camera just because it does have a bigger sensor, or is usually the better sensor, so that's something to stick with when you're in darker spaces. And of course it does a better job here clearly, and you do get more background blur, the natural background blur, because the Oppo's main wide lens is a 1-inch sensor. So essentially, since it's bigger, it can collect more light and you can see more detail. And since the Oppo has a bigger sensor, it already has the bigger advantage in low light. Yes, it may be slower taking a picture, but it's worth it. The other advantage I mentioned earlier is background blur. So the bigger the sensor, the more background blur you see. So full frame cameras, there's a lot of it. This sensor is bigger, so naturally if you take the right picture, the results coming out of the Oppo can look like it's coming out of a camera. So if you're really into photography or even videography, I feel like naturally you're gonna go for the bigger sensor because you already know how good it is. So it's nice to be able to experience other phones out there like the Xiaomi and Vivo having 1-inch sensors versus the iPhone and like Samsung phones which does not. It's also helpful when you're shooting video because if you want to get that cinematic look with a nice background blur, the Oppo is going to be much better getting that than the iPhone. Now moving on to telephoto, the iPhone's never been like the top dog in this category. When you're facing it, even like US brands from Pixel and Samsung, it's a no-brainer that they're going to zoom in more. And now facing it with the Oppo, which max zooms at 120x, even though it's not the best looking one, it's still way better than 15x. And of course, a lot of people will not usually use this range, but it is helpful when you want to see something from afar, like if you're at the back of the classroom and you want to take a picture of the board, or even looking at a sign across the street. I would say 3x is really good for the most part, especially during daylight. It's kind of hard to tell between the two, but when you start to zoom in around 6x or especially 15x, you can see the digitization and all that stuff on the iPhone. And shooting 3x with the Oppo is really good as well, especially if you want to get that background blur. Clearly it's much more than an iPhone, so still I think it's usable. I've used it with my past video in Spain to get some cool images from the 3x, which I was surprised about. So if you do want to check that out, I'll have the links down below or at the end of the screen. Now for selfies, I would say the Oppo is really neutral for the most part, whereas on iPhone it can be too cool, too yellow, and if you're indoors, it can be too warm. And for low light, it does seem for the most part, the Oppo is a bit sharper than an iPhone. I guess the only downside for Oppo's front-facing camera is 1080p max for video. For portrait mode, the Oppo only has the option for 1x and 3x, whereas on iPhone is 1x, 2x, and 3x. I'm a huge fan of the 2x just because it's great to use all around, indoors and outdoors, and it does give that nice portrait look. I do think the 1x is too wide, and for 3x you do need a lot of space, so ideally you would use that outdoors. unless you're like in a big room indoors. Now for the pictures itself, I'm gonna say the Oppo can be a bit too hot on the highlights, whereas on iPhone it does have a nice roll off on the skin. Now when you're in the shadows, it's not too bad, but it does have a higher contrast looking picture. So it's nice to see these phone cameras coming out with a 1-inch sensor, which is pretty much the same sensor as regular point and shoot. So we're slowly replacing them, which is I guess a great thing, which everything is in one device, and all the images will look better too. And I think it will be forever for a phone company to put a full frame sensor in these cameras, but I think 1-inch sensors are just good enough for regular consumers. So hopefully we'll see 1-inch sensors across all phones as standard. So let me know what you guys think, and I do have a cinematic vlog shot only on the Oppo Find X6, so I'll link that above. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys later.